we've been working on this project for 117 years, and it is really taken off. And we've had a wonderful speaker series under the direction of our M2E committee that's done such great work. I want to thank the chairs of the committee who are here today for their very good work and getting such wonderful speakers. And today, I'm delighted, personally delighted to hear this talk by one of the really leading economists in the United States who works on this area, and we're really lucky to have him here today. So I want to welcome you. I very much look forward to your comments, and if you want to do the honors, Chris.
Well, again, echoing Ernie, I'd just like to welcome everyone once again to another installment of our Media Economics and Entrepreneurship speaker series. This represents the midway point and a high point, having Stephen Wildman here. And again, similar to Ernie, I want to acknowledge my co-director and partner, Gabe Kahn, and also all the members of the MPE committee who are here, and all of the people who helped make these many events in Annenberg possible. One of the key drivers of this project is exploring the many ways that information and communications technology, ICT, and the policy directives overseeing ICT development have an impact on media firm business models and strategic decision making. And all of these strategic decisions could regard anything from content development to pursuing profit maximizing routes of distribution, and also content bundling and pricing. And we're very lucky to have someone who's devoted the lion's share of his professional life to investigating these areas that really do drive not only the M2E program, but also some of the other signature programs at this school, including ARNIC, our new Annenberg Innovation Lab, and also the Communication Leadership and Policy Center. So our guest today, Stephen Wildman, comes to us by way of Michigan State University, where he's the James H. Quello Professor of Telecommunication Studies, and also the director of the James H. and Mary B. Quello Center for Telecommunications Management and Law. Previously, he was in the Communication Studies Department in Northwestern, and he has a PhD and MA from up north at that small school called Stanford University. He's published widely in the field, and the vast majority of these publications have been recognized for the intervention they made in defining the field. So join me in welcoming Stephen Wildman.
Thank you. I think had I been asked to summarize a set of topics I've worked on over the years, I probably couldn't have done as good a job as you just did. Hopefully it's recorded someplace I can take it back with me. When I was approached to give this talk, I was asked to make it somewhat reflective and an overview looking at the basic ideas that sort of motivated my research over the years. And I was also told that this is part of an effort to expose students as well as faculty to more of the economics behind media and communication industries. Fortunately, I'm an economist, so it would be hard for me to talk about anything else. And what I'm combining in this talk really are two sets of interests, one that goes back a number of years. I'm surprised at how many people I've been running into just in the building that I've met at various places in the various way stations in my academic career. Jonathan Aronson and I started working on trade and services way back in the 80s. We were trying to guess how many years ago it was, and with some embarrassment. But at any rate, some of the work I'm talking about really initiated from that process, some of these basic ideas about what motivates what I'm calling flows in media products. And so I'm going to talk about that, and even though I had sort of walked away from that for a while, I've come back to it recently with some new ideas and some new data. In addition, I'm looking at issues as to how newer technologies, the internet especially, but it could be mobile, are changing the underlying structural underpinnings of media, and what the economic logic is that's inherent in the new technologies. And what I think is we're going to see a radical transformation, not just of stuff. The internet and the services it offers are already radical compared to what was before, But if we think of the direction that TV is heading, and any service that was spectrum using and channel-based as opposed to server-based, the logic, the inherent economic logic of the two different ways of getting content out there, storing it and so forth, give rise to different structures. And I'm going to talk towards the end about my more recent work that's saying, where is this leading us? What can we expect? All right? Now, if you actually looked at the schedule and you saw my title, you'll realize that I've switched the subtitle and the title, but it's the same words. And if you've been around the field long enough, you realize I'm channeling Marshall McLuhan in a sense that back in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan was sort of the Chris Anderson of his day. That he was sort of a communication scholar, philosopher that caught the public attention by, and some people would argue he was channeling this Innes, a Canadian economist, that the nature of the medium itself dictates in important ways the way that humans process the content that's there. And so the experience and what you take away from the consumption of what would otherwise look to be identical content becomes very different depending on the medium it's filtered through. Now, I'm not talking about the psychology of cognition, but I'm using that same play on words. That when we're asking what drives flow, what I'll talk about in a moment, flows of media products, in that case, the message is the message. And it's the economics of the way that messages are constructed and the economics that give rise to the incentives, in particular in the investments of messages that have important consequences that dictate the kinds of flows we see in the media industries. And then when we look at the structural characteristics of media, the new media have a different economic logic, and that gives rise to different structures, different industry structures, different service structures. And so in that case, the medium is the message. So we have the media, or the message is a message, but the medium is a message, but it's metaphorical. Right? All right, start by asking about what flows are. And we tend not to think of flows very much when we look at economic markets, but flows, I'll talk about them geographically mostly, but they're temporal too, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. We can just call them the movement of media products among geographic regions that would intuitively seem to correspond to natural media markets. Okay, a few examples. I choose a lot of examples when you look for them. The one that's caught a lot of attention for people that are interested in domestic cultures, cultural protectionism and so forth, the flows in motion pictures, flows in television programs, flows in books, recorded music, and in almost all of these, the flows tend to be from large countries to small countries, with the U.S. playing a preeminent position. We tend not to characterize it this way, but we have flows of printed products as well. So I did my graduate work at Stanford under Jim Ross, and Jim Ross was an economist that focused a lot on newspapers, and he described what he called an umbrella structure for newspapers, where in the LA region, for example, the LA Times casts what he called a circulation umbrella over surrounding suburbs. People in the suburbs read the Times. People in LA don't read the suburban papers, or go to Chicago, it's the same thing. The Tribune's everywhere. And the Evanston Times, which is only a daily, is never read by somebody in Chicago. So we have a flow that is the product that's being produced for the center city is flowing to the suburbs, the smaller areas, but nothing's coming back. New York Times covers the whole U.S. I've raised this question with students the last few years and say, anybody know what an imported distant signal is? And it sort of dates you, but you've seen them. You don't call it this anymore. In the early days of cable, before we had HBO and before we had CNN and so on, partly because of FCC restrictions, but when those were relaxed, Ted Turner and some other entrepreneurs said, I've got a TV station, I could have a national audience, I put it on a satellite and send it down to cable systems all around the country. And so those were imported signals, and there's this whole regulatory apparatus that determines how people get compensated for that content when it gets moved around. But if you look at the pattern, where do those imported distant signals come from? They come from large metropolitan areas, and they go everywhere else. There's not like a local Lansing station, in my almost hometown. It doesn't go anywhere. It's lucky if anybody local takes it. And yeah, look at YouTube. You've got videos from all over the world on YouTube, and those are flows in an important sense as well. Right? And as I mentioned, they're almost always on net. If you look into the balance, how much goes from a small market to a large market and vice versa, they disproportionately flow from the large markets to the smaller markets. Much more than you would expect if you just compared the financial size or the population sizes of the two markets. And when Jonathan and I were starting to look at these issues of trade and services, and media were defined as a service, I guess they still are, although I'm not sure. I raised the question then, what do we mean by a service, and I'm still not totally satisfied. But at any rate, at that time I had to think about, why is this? If you're going to talk about it, you have to explain it. And the book that came out in that series that we both published in then was a presentation of a model that explains flows. And later on, I realized the model is sort of a general framework that can be applied to flows no matter where we find them in the media. All right? Now, why do we care? Well, one is what I just mentioned, that if you're an academic and a researcher, it's an interesting anomaly. It's more fun to solve anomalies and to explain again something everybody else already understands, unless you can show that the previous explanation was wrong, of course. And so, I mean, it is an anomaly. You don't have, the directionality is imbalanced compared to what prior intuition would suggest. And if you're in a smaller market, typically people in smaller markets feel they are, to some extent, inundated with this foreign content that comes from places that they don't necessarily resonate with in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of basic values. I grew up in a small Midwestern town, and it's fairly religiously conservative, and not everybody feels that what they're getting from Hollywood is what they would produce if they controlled the mechanisms of production. And the same thing with suburban papers. If you take the same size town and you put it out in the middle of nowhere, say a town of 20,000 people, it'll have a daily paper. Take that same town and you put it next to Chicago or New York or in LA, chances are you'll be lucky to get a weekly paper. Why? Because people are reading the center city paper, and it undermines the financial basis for the local paper. And so these flows have consequences, and if we're worried about things like the role that media play in a democratic debate, then we should be concerned about these flows. Right. So I want to use data from films. Films, at least from the international side, are probably the best documented of the flows. But the patterns I'll illustrate are there, and to a lesser degree, but they're still quite pronounced in television programs and music and in books. And to see how imbalanced these flows can be, this comes from a paper that I'm working on right now with Professor Choi in Korea, one of my graduate students, Sang-Yep Lee. And we were just saying, if we look at the box offices of, like the domestic box office for other countries and the US, and we ask, what fraction of that box office revenue is generated by films that are domestic or films that come from somewhere else, and we identify where those somewhere else's are, and we have this data set with 30 countries in it. And those 30 countries tend to be, for the most part, the bigger countries in the world in terms of films. We can see that on average, across those 30 countries, the US accounts for about 2/3 of the domestic box office. Right? Who's number two? The UK is number 2 with about 7%. France, 2%, and it falls off from there. China was number 5 with 0.5% on average of other countries' box office. And virtually everybody else becomes close to invisible as you move it on out.
What happened to India?
Okay, actually, India is, we had to drop it from our data set. We had two sources. We had Box Office Mojo, and we had Film Digest. And when for data reliability, we then compared the data from the two. And if there was a 2-to-1 difference between the two sources, we threw it out. So we threw out India, we threw out Japan, we threw out Switzerland, and 2 other countries because we couldn't use the data. But you're right. Had we felt comfortable for econometric purposes of keeping India in, India still wouldn't have showed up much in terms of the box office. But in terms of number of films, they would look very big. They have a lot of films, but a lot of very inexpensive films that, you know, you may find them in LA. You can probably find an Indian film in the cinema here. I can tell you, probably can't find one anywhere in Michigan. Although I could go to the right video store in Detroit, for example, and pick them up. All right, another representation is to say, well, okay, big countries produce more films than small countries. So maybe it's just the fact that they produce more films gives them a larger share of other people's box offices. Well, let's see what the average film does then. And the average US film accounts for about 15% of the average foreign country's box office. Now, we're looking at this from a US base, and you have to realize that we're much more of a movie-going country, culture than most countries are. As a fraction of GDP and as a fraction of time and attention that people give to it, people elsewhere, for the most part, don't spend the same amount of time and resources going to the cinema that we do. In fact, it's harder to find a cinema. It's much less convenient in most countries than here. So when we're looking at 15%, it means that people are going to seeing 6, 7 films a year on average somewhere else, if we account for one of those. The UK comes in with about 6%. I circled the Czech Republic because that sounds kind of strange. Why is the Czech Republic there? And I'll tell you in a moment. Germany and Hong Kong, again, we're approaching the range of invisibility, and we've only gone out 5. And why is the Czech Republic there? Because not that many years ago, the Czech Republic was part of Czechoslovakia. And now we have these 2 separate countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Slovakia still has a quasi-domestic market relationship with the Czech Republic. Within Slovakia, Czech films account for about 8% of the box office. And when you average that across all the places where it's invisible, it still comes out more than most people do on average. If we get a more appropriate comparison and we look at the median foreign box office penetration, that looks pretty similar to the average. And then the same thing for the films. Well, the Czech Republic drops out because there's that one anomaly, which is a neighboring country of Slovakia, that sort of accounts for why their average looks so high. And remember, it's an unweighted average. Every country counts the same, even though there's only a few million people in Slovakia.
This is across all foreign box offices?
This is the 30 in our sample.
The 30.
Right. Although this has most of the larger ones. Right. India is not there, but yeah, for the most part, these are the bigger ones. You'll see the sample here. Now, if we look at the division of the domestic box office for these same 30 countries, we can say how much does do domestic films account for of the local box office? Well, the U.S., our films account for about 95% of all the movie going in the U.S. The next highest country is Korea. We have, the last 4 or 5 years, we've had this Korean wave. Korean films are being exported throughout Asia and to a lesser extent the rest of the world. In Korea, Korean films account for a little under 50%. U.S. films for almost 43%. I highlighted that row because once you fall below that, in every other country, U.S. films account for more of the domestic box office than do domestic films. And it falls off very rapidly, right? We don't go down very far before we're getting below 30 and then below 20%, and getting down to below 2% as we move on down. And they're just a graphical representation of the same thing. All right, let me just pause for a moment. I'm using films as illustrative of what we see in other media markets, and I should say that the film data tends to be more extreme, and I don't understand the reasons yet, but it seems that the more expensive is the media product, the greater is the imbalance that's produced in the flows. Right? It's there on TV programs, bigger there than it is for music, and so on. And so that's something else yet to be explained. My guess is that when we get into the logic of what produces this in a moment, that the payoff to investing more in the budget for producing something diminishes more rapidly for other kinds of products than they do for films and then for TV programs. Why that is, I'm not sure. I should say I don't know. Okay. So why do we have imbalanced flows? Well, it gets back to the economics largely of investments in content. Now, part of this, bigger countries have produced more films, TV programs. They have more to export. But even after you factor that out, and this paper I just referenced a little bit ago, we sort of separate out the two influences. The budget differences contribute most to most of the explanation. All right, well, content is what drives the demand for a media product. And a media product's content is what economists call a non-rival good. And that just means that if I read Hamlet, right, that doesn't mean you can't read Hamlet. In fact, probably billions of people have been reading Hamlet. There's still as much Hamlet left over now, despite all this consumption, as there was at the beginning. Right? And we contrast that to a rival good, or a good that's rivalrous in consumption, or private good. It means that if I use it, you can't. My soda is a good example, or the water. Right? If I drink it, you can't. In fact, you wouldn't want to, right? But there's an exclusivity in the consumption decision. And that makes a big difference then in terms of how media firms, or firms that invest and produce non-rival goods, they're sort of the profit calculus as opposed to those that produce a rival good. For a non-rival good, we're saying, okay, I've produced this unit of content. That's an upfront investment. We sometimes call that a first copy cost, especially for printed media. Right? But your production budget has gone in. You can't pull it out. It's sunk once it's there. And we're asking, how do I get it back? The return on that production budget investment is the sum of the margin that the producer earns on your consumption and my consumption on everybody else who consumes that. Right? So if I put an extra dollar or an extra $1 million into the budget of a motion picture, and I'm asking, will I get $1 million back? I have to say, of all the people that might consume it, will enough of them pay more, or go to the movie more, or watch it on TV and generate more advertising revenue, enough to generate at least $1 million back on earnings to me? And we can see that if we make the whole country, that whole market bigger, then we're multiplying the number of people to whom that content investment generates, from whom it generates more income. And so the marginal return gets bigger, the larger is the potential audience. So we end up with producers and for films in countries that have very large populations, and especially very wealthy populations. They have to go a long ways before the return, and it's the expected return, right? You can have very expensive flops, and you can have unanticipated hits with low budgets, but by and large, there's a very strong correlation between the size of the budget for a motion picture and the revenues it brings in. And that is limited by the size of the market you can sell into. And as you increase the size of the market, the return to that marginal dollar goes up, so you spend more before you finally come to the point at which marginal revenue generated by a dollar of production in the production budget equals only $1 coming back. Right? And so we find then that the larger is the audience, the larger is the budget, and you only invest more in the budget because you think it makes for a more appealing product. So you have a lot that's spent to create something appealing in the large markets, and that means that you have a more appealing product. So you would expect then that you would have the flow from the stuff that, expensive stuff should flow to countries that produce cheap stuff, and not much going in the other direction, which is what we find. And here are just some from the data we use. It's a 2007 data set looking at the average budget per film. The U.S., 31 million. Second on that list is New Zealand with 14 million. And I'll come back. New Zealand's a small country, right? But there's some explanations for that. Part of it's an anomaly, but part of it's explainable by the way we define the market. And also Colombian films. We're getting down to the bottom. We're looking at $221,000 compared to $31 million. We're looking at more than 100-to-1 difference, 100-to-1 ratio. And unless movie producers just like to throw money away, then they must be doing this for a reason. It has to produce something that generates appeal. And that becomes the financial basis that motivates flows. And we can see this if we look at newspapers. LA Times is a big paper. You move to the suburbs, you get smaller papers. The Chicago Tribune, a big, thick paper, and you go to the Evanston Times, it comes out once a week, and it's about this thick. So what are you getting? You're getting more international coverage, more sports coverage, more business coverage, content that's appealing to people in the suburbs that then won't be provided by the local paper. So you have more content investment that creates a broader interest in a larger market. Now, that can't be the whole explanation, right? If it was just because we have to ask what keeps the markets at least somewhat separate. If the whole world was one just, what, 7 billion, we had, what do you are, 6 or 7 billion people now that had homogeneous tastes, everybody preferred exactly the same thing, then it would not matter where people located to produce. And so production would flow to the lowest cost locales. You go to Mexico, you go to Venezuela, maybe not Venezuela, not a good choice right now. Go to Thailand. But that's not what happens. Why? Because we have these differences in taste, differences in language, differences in culture, and those differences create barriers to imported films. If you're in Europe, you're saying, well, American films look kind of bland to me. Right? People still go to see them, right? We look at the box office, and even though this is a sort of, people look down their nose at American films, and it tends to be more academics than people that actually go see the films. They're sort of saying, what I watch most is what I like least. It doesn't quite make sense. But nevertheless, there's a difference. Right? If you look at the films that travel, it tends to be action adventure, drama type stuff. Comedy tends to be more specific to different cultures. Comedy doesn't travel near as well as drama. A car crash is a car crash. A death by assassination is the same no matter where it happens, and so on. And that's part of the reason why. What you get is a lot more special effects. And there's this reverse migration of the best talent around the world, most compelling talent, then goes to the large markets as well. Political boundaries create differences amongst markets. And in the US, because every municipality has their own government, they raise their own taxes, they have their own school systems, there are things that people are interested in that are local, and people that report locally have an advantage in covering that. And so you take the Chicago Tribune if you're in the Chicago suburbs because you want the international coverage, you want the state and national coverage, but you subscribe to the local paper if you do, because you get better coverage of things that are local. And then, of course, there are legal restrictions. Korea is a good example where there's still a quota on imported films. And most of these go to Europe where there's a 50% requirement. 50% of television time has to be occupied by European productions. And those create advantages as well. Why is that important? Because if we didn't have some kind of barriers, there'd be no reason for profit-motivated producers to stay in one place. They would just follow, they just go where it's least expensive to be. Right? Now, I mentioned a moment ago that New Zealand is something of an anomaly. It's a big anomaly. It's a tiny country, I think under 10 million people, $14 million average film budget. Part of that is because people go there to shoot things like the Ring trilogy. And the accounting of this stuff means that sometimes you get material that really should be counted as a U.S. production counted locally. But it's something else going on there as well. As while linguistic and cultural differences in taste create barriers, similarities in language and culture expand what is really the natural market for production beyond national boundaries. And so, and I've been arguing for years, we shouldn't think of the U.S. and when we think of as the primary market and thinking of film flows, it's the larger worldwide English language market. So we've got everybody in the UK and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and Singapore, although having spent 6 months in Singapore, I know that even though English is the official language, the de facto language in the street is Hokkien Chinese in many cases, if you want to buy something from a vendor. But nevertheless, the real market for U.S. productions is much bigger, and it works the other way around. If you're in the UK, if you're in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, then you're selling into an effectively larger market, and your film budget should be larger. Right? The work that I'm doing right now with Sang-Yep Lee, one of our graduate students, then sort of goes back and looks at this and says, if we add in of the GDPs of all the countries that have the same language as the U.S., or Germany, or Italy or Spain and so on, and we ask, what does that contribute? We did a econometric analysis. What does the same language population outside the country contribute to film budgets? Well, we found it looks something like this. That for the US, because we're such a large part of the English language worldwide market, that extra English language speaking population adds about 5% to the total budget. Right, so when we say we disentangle the domestic GDP contribution from foreign GDPs in the same language, UK, almost 40% of the budget of a UK film can be explained by the fact that they're selling into this large English language market. Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland, all really small countries in terms of population, you're getting about, and so I've highlighted these, a little over $5 million of their budgets, average budgets, are explained by this, the fact that they can sell to other English-speaking countries. Now, $1 of Australian income doesn't equate to $1 of US income, and there's a difference. There's actually about a 10-to-1 difference. So that the marginal impact of somebody in another country with the same language is about a tenth as much as domestic, but nevertheless it's positive, it's not negative. You know, Germany, you can sell to Austria. Spain actually gets a fairly large impact from being able to sell into the larger, Hispanic market in Latin America. Right? It's about 50% of the budget for a Spanish language, a Spanish production can be accounted for by this larger Spanish population in the rest of the world. A good thing for Spain. Italy never did a very good job as being, as a colonial power, and so we just put them in there as a point of comparison, that they get nothing because they have nothing. France gets a little bit out of it. Actually, it does okay when you look at it. And we can turn that around. I didn't bring a slide for this, but we can say then, what does that mean in terms of fraction of a box office? So, I was showing the US accounts for about 2/3 of the average foreign box office, the UK about 7%, and it falls off in third place. France is about 2%. Well, that extra $5+ million for the Irish, New Zealand, and Australian films in the budgets is worth to them about 1.6, 1.7% of the box office, almost as much as the average French film generates. It's not bad. I mean, their marginal contribution is bigger than everybody beyond France for the original contribution. All right, and this is all I'm going to. This is everything I'm going to say on this slide. The flows are temporal as well, and so I've talked about geographic flows. They're the most visible, but you're in the movie capital of the world, and you know that a film starts in the cinema, then it moves to DVDs and to pay-per-view, and it goes into cable, and it spreads throughout the world, and there's this whole time sequence. Right? Well, we can think of the film then as flowing from one market to the next, temporally divided markets. Now, this is traditionally explained as a means of price discrimination. Those people that are least patient pay most to the cinema, and you collect their money first, and then you move to those willing to pay least. But it's also a unidirectional flow. That you can think of each of these subsequent channels, right, from the cinema to DVD and so forth, as being a separate market. Stuff starts out one place and it moves in the other direction. It's a unidirectional flow. And for the most part, you're getting flows from the larger temporally defined markets to the small ones. Think of the primetime TV programs that are broadcast or shown by the American major broadcast networks. And you can still see Friends. Right? Sometimes you can see nothing but Friends when you look at what's being rebroadcast. Well, it used to be primetime TV for, what was it, NBC? I forget who it was. I don't watch enough TV. But it's going from the larger market to the smaller. You get the most revenue out of that primetime market, and now it's going to off-prime. Something that's produced off-prime doesn't go back into prime. So we've got unidirectionality in temporal flows as well. All right, so for flows, the message is the message. Now, let's talk about the structural aspects of media, and this is some of the newer work I've been doing. And I'm speaking very, very broadly and talking about structure, that clearly what you see, if we look at MySpace or Facebook, and there's no structural counterpart in terms of the kind of services that are offered and the way that they're presented and organized that's on, not in the internet domain, right? Prior to Web 2.0 and the interactivity and the capabilities that created, there were no counterpoints to a Facebook that existed in the non-virtual world. Right? So clearly, I mean, it's obvious in this case that the medium is a message, that all these structures we're seeing, the way it's organized, are consequences of an economic logic that's built into the new capabilities that are there. Nothing dictates that Facebook has to be organized the way it is. In fact, it didn't start organized the way it is. You can see all the gaffes that Zuckerberg has made when you try to make user data available to advertisers and everybody complains and they back off. And so the model is being invented in process, right, but through trial and error experimentation. But nevertheless, it's being revealed over time. I don't think we have good economic models yet to explain something like social media. We can talk about things like network effects. The larger the number of users, then the more valuable is the service to everybody else. But we also know that for social media, the people you care about, the fairly small defined set of people. You don't want to be available worldwide. It's from 100 to 500 or less people that you care about on Facebook. And so network effects have to be pretty small. I think it's indirect network effects. You get a lot of people together, then third parties come in and offer all sorts of enhancements and services, and it builds on itself. But still, these are only beginnings of what hopefully will be more sophisticated understandings of social media in the future. But even for traditional services like television, or it's probably better to broadly speak of video now, we can see that the new media, the logic of the internet, and especially the fact that content is downloaded from servers as opposed to being streamed through separate independent channels, is changing the logic of organization and the structures of these industries. And that's what I want to talk about. So I spent a fair amount of time thinking about this, and every time I go back to it, I get new ideas. But I'll spend the rest of this talk then dealing with these issues. And I should ask, how much time do you want left for questions?
Minimum 5.
Minimum 5, okay.
So really you have about 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, I think this can be compressed fairly quickly. And just think about traditional broadcast media and how the nature of that service. Everything comes through a channel. Right? Nothing is stored out there. It's not a pull medium, it's a push medium. And so the more channels are, the more content you can get. This notion that you probably don't even hear about something like a 500-channel universe anymore. 20 years ago, when somebody asked Tom Malone, who was head of then TCI and who became Comcast and so forth, where are we going to? Well, as we use compression technologies and we get into fiber, we can start offering maybe 500 channels. And everybody says, whoa, 500 channels. That means you can look at 500 different options at any given time. Right? Well, go to YouTube. You can look at several 100 million different options at any given time. That's a huge difference. Right? And why did we only have 500 channels? We actually never really fully got to 500 channels in most places because everything has to come through a channel. Channels are expensive. And therefore, the constraint that drove the economics of that system is the cost of adding channels. When it's costly to add a channel, you have to say, does the financial return to adding a channel justify that cost? And you don't go very far before you say no. That meant that channels became very valuable assets, and you had this implicit competition among content suppliers to occupy those channels. That's mediated by networks and so forth. And so the channel operators become gatekeepers that do that selection process. Implicitly, it's bidding on the part of content suppliers for access to the limited number of channels. Now, what this means then is that the content that will attract either a larger audience or an audience that's willing to pay more is what crowds everything else out. And the larger is a taste-defined audience, like for primetime dramas or sitcoms and so on, then the more investment gets put into that, and stuff that attracts a large and expensive audience will occupy more channels as people compete for the attention of the audience that attracts, and it crowds the other stuff off. There are big advantages of geographic reach. We don't produce our own TV programs in every local market. Instead, we have networks that distribute them throughout the whole country. And that's realizing economies of scale, but the same content investment incentives I talked about earlier with flows apply here as well. Once you reach a nationwide audience, you produce more expensive content as well, which makes locally originated stuff more at a competitive disadvantage. And then strategically, you may try to say only we, if you're a content supplier, you're especially a distribution entity, has access to certain popular programming. Look at the sort of the bitter battle right now between Comcast and the FCC as to whether or not Comcast should make available to satellite providers access to local sports teams. Right? Comcast is saying, this is in Philadelphia, we have it, you can't have it, it's going to give us an advantage in competing for subscribers. Right? And that gives rise to a whole set of policy concerns that really motivated the development of video policy in the United States from actually sort of electronic media policies from the very beginning, back with radio and the Radio Act in 1927. There is this concern that because commercial motivations are meant to attract, or commercial motivations lead to trying to attract larger audiences, and audiences aren't concerned about the impact of their own knowledge base on what other people, the greater value of their learning to the larger society, that content that should be consumed won't be presented. And so we'll have an overconsumption of stuff that has no larger payoff to society, and an underconsumption of stuff that we really need, that should be valued to furthering the democratic process, creating an informed citizenry. And then there's concern because we have a small number of channels in distribution media that the small number of firms that own that will use them in an anti-competitive sense. And then that led to a whole bunch of policy responses in terms of saying, we're going to prevent people from merging to monopoly. In fact, we won't. We do now, but for a long time you couldn't own two TV stations in the same market. We limit how much of the country cable operators can cover. We had requirements that we don't mostly have now in terms of what could be shown during prime time access rule. Networks couldn't program an hour of that time. The fairness doctrine, you had to show contending viewpoints. That's gone. Cable operators couldn't kick broadcasters off of the cable. They had to retransmit them. That's the must carry, and so on. So all these are consequences of the structure of the economics of a system based on providing content through costly channels. Right? Now, we're moving to something different now. Right? Most people still watch traditional television streamed through a fixed channel, but the trend is pretty obvious, especially among younger people or even people that have DVRs. For people that have a digital video recorder, over 50% of all viewing occurs at times other than when the program is broadcast. Nobody really likes the fact that they have to, we had appointment viewing in the past. If you want to watch your favorite program, you have to be in front of the TV when it comes on. That's not necessarily the case anymore for most people. And it's the constraints of the old system that dictated that. If you have stuff linearly flowing through a channel, somebody has to program it. If we're pulling it off a server, the notion of programming disappears. It's an irrelevancy. It's more of creating a table of contents and a search mechanism. And we can see the internet space and the on-demand video space rapidly growing. That's going to, once we get to the place where internet video becomes easy, and we'll get there. We're having these halting attempts like Google TV and Apple TV, but we're getting close and we'll be there soon. The logic of that and the convenience of that would just sort of overwhelm, in my opinion, the older system. Now, because there was costly channels that limited what was available in the older system, and if we think of what we do when we're viewing over the internet, right? We're streaming something. Each of us has basically what's a dedicated channel. And that channel can be retargeted to servers where we can pick up what we want. So the channel capacity constraint disappears once you get to server-based distribution. And instead, we have to ask, what constraint is it that dictates the sort of the economic logic of a video system when it's server-based? And it's really server capacity. And the marginal cost of server capacity is trivial compared to the cost of adding an incremental channel. So the incentive is to be inclusive and to bring more and more stuff in on the off chance that somebody may like it. So that YouTube can have hundreds of millions of videos that are sitting there, and most of them are rarely watched after those first, people's relatives and friends watch something and sell themselves being made fools of, and then it goes on and it's lost. But it's kept. Right? It's there if you want to see it. In a way, this is Chris Anderson's long tail, although whether you end up with long tail type consumption patterns is another question. So this is just a schematic representation of everything flowing through channels, and I've pretty much talked about that. Right? That for everything that's going to be watched at the set-top, at the TV set, you have to choose amongst a channel. It's got to be on a channel available to you, and you choose among those streaming channels. We're moving towards what's called IPTV, Internet Protocol Television. It's, what we're getting from Verizon and AT&T is sort of a quasi-step in that direction. They really end up with something closer to traditional television. But in Europe and a few other places, what they have is where you actually have all the video that's sitting on a server. And so rather than an internet server, you're getting something on a locally maintained system and you're accessing their server. It's the same thing you do if you're looking at on-demand programming from your local cable service. Right? They have a server sitting out there and you have a dedicated channel and you can pick the material that's sitting there. Right? So this is really where we are today. 2 minutes, okay? We're getting video coming through multiple over the internet channels, and it's competing with what's coming through the cable head end. And that, the center part is getting more and more constricted, and it will do so in the future in terms of who watches it, and the economics of continuing to invest in that. The near future is going to look something like this. 5 or 10 years out, I don't think we're going to have much streaming at all, that everything will go to servers and be downloadable. And whether that center part ever really stays, once you get to the point where there's a lot of stuff available over the web, you have to ask yourself, is there any kind of an economic advantage to having a local cable system as a repository for that? It's more of an engineering question than it is an economic logic question. It's not clear to me that that's the case. And if that's not the case, then in the long run, political pressures will force us to move to the more logical system. Okay? Actually, this is pretty much it. So I think I've almost made the 2 minutes. And in fact, I think I pretty much described it. I might as well just stop here, because I think that's the vision of the future. One, everything is server-based. You have unimaginable amount of content out there. What that's going to mean in the long run, my guess is that we will have the same content that's repackaged by different people that are resident on the web, and they will be saying, choose us because we can approximate the package you want. It's somebody that operates as an intermediary to call stuff ahead of time because we still need those services. And we can see the antecedent of that in text-based stuff that's happening with RSS feeds right now. But I subscribe to some that cover advertising and media, and what they do is they call it from the New York Times, from Ad Age and so forth, and they package it together. And there's a logic of that because I don't want all the New York Times all the time, and a lot of people don't want it at all, but I like subcomponents. And we're moving to an era when it becomes feasible and profitable to package the subcomponents and offer those instead. So that's where I see us going.
Well, thank you very much. Any questions?
Hey, Robbie.
Sorry, I was late. How do you see this new model affecting the way that flows work? Because there will be more content and incentives to pull from the big producers won't be as high, right? And so maybe there will be an equalization?
Yeah, I think there will be an indirect effect. As you get more competition within any market, then any producer's share of the total audience gets smaller and smaller. And there's pretty good empirical evidence that as this happens, content budgets start to be diminished. And so I think one thing we may be seeing here is that as we get more and more fragmentation, budgets will get smaller, and that will start to even things out to some degree in terms of flows across countries. that the U.S. advantage in terms of budget size will probably get a little smaller than it's been. Should mention Robbie, who just spoke at our invitation at Michigan State, and his presentation was much more dramatic and colorful than mine was. I was kind of blown away.
But not as large in scope.
Sure. On your penultimate slide there, where you sort of describe where things are going, looking at this, so how does this impact the current corporate structure that we have now in media? You mentioned the Comcast, NBCU merger, et cetera. But so we're talking about a system where we're removing the cable operator as a sort of aggregator or packager, right?
Right.
We're dramatically lowering the barriers to being able to produce content and get us through a tube.
Yes, as long as we don't impose artificial barriers on, I shouldn't say artificial, as long as we allow the opening up of access online, right, to content aggregators that exist there. It could be Hulu, it could be somebody else that's pulling together content from various places. The whole corporate structure that's been built around organizing channels and packaging channels together becomes totally irrelevant. And so what I see is that the system we have now is irrelevant to the media of the future. And that's.
So do you see these, I mean, the Warner Brothers and the other sort of big producers of these content, do they still have an advantage in this kind of system?
There are advantages in terms of somebody has to be the financier. Right, so we've still got the Warner Brothers and so forth doing that. And there may be advantages in being a better, there will always be payoffs to being better as a filter, identifying stuff up front in terms of what you want to invest in. But I don't see it arising from the structural implications. What I see in the short term, though, and we're already seeing this, we have Netflix that's starting to appear as an over-the-top cable system. Right? And so some people attribute a lot of cord cutting to the ease and the low cost of Netflix. Well, what are the current cable companies saying? They're saying, well, we produce and we own that content. We're going to deny that content to Netflix. So the battles that we've had in the past, in terms of just similar to Comcast with the local sports teams in Philadelphia, or go back to the 1992 Cable Act, where the Congress said, if you are a cable system operator and you're vertically integrated into the provision of a network, you have to make that network available to competitors so it can't be used to gain competitive leverage. Those kinds of issues are going to be replayed, I think, in this space. And that's when I'm saying that there will have to be pressures that go through the political system. I think they will come about.
Yeah. No, go ahead, please.
So just follow up these two questions. What do you think of the traditional superstar making strategy in the near future? Because you could imagine if the market gets infinitely segmented and then everybody gets, has more niches to look at. On the other hand, the internet has been so great in spreading the word of mouth and making also the counterforce would be just making the superstar strategy work even better. Where do you see that?
That's a real good question, and it sort of gets back to another. Some of this was inspired by looking at YouTube and saying, boy, it sure doesn't look like that kind of scrolling lineup of programs I see when I look at my cable channel, the cable program guide, what explains that. And if you're looking at a user-generated video, and I know you're looking at user-generated content, there's possibly two different models that we might use. The one we have right now is where you have this series of filters, and you start from sort of an ideal memo that gets given to a lower ranking producer who, if he likes it, then will put more talent to it and take it farther up the chain of command, and then eventually you pitch to a studio and so on and so forth. And that's one process. It's an expensive filtering process, and a lot of stuff gets left on the cutting room table at various stages. Another way of doing this is having the equivalent of found art, where the notion of found art, I think it was Andy Warhol said, well, I saw this thing, it looks beautiful, I didn't make it, but I recognized that I put it up here, and therefore, why shouldn't the aesthetics of that be appreciated as much as something I created? I think we have something similar that possibly could happen when we're looking at user-generated content. You've got zillions and zillions of things out there, and you allow for people to like it, to indicate they like it, and it feeds on itself. And so, the possibility for Blair Witch projects to be discovered on a regular basis becomes a new model. And started the process of developing a formal economic model of this, and under what conditions you go one way or the other. But I see this as a possibility. In that case, star making probably becomes a lot less important. Right? I mean, the value of the star is it reduces the uncertainty associated with the investment in a project. And if you can find things that become that are found and turn out to be popular, then that diminishes the need to have the star to reduce that uncertainty, because the cost of the finding process is very low.
Yes.
Well, just to follow up on that, but then so you have like a Justin Bieber or something, right? So it starts out, millions of views on YouTube and is now about to be released as theatrical release of a major motion picture. So that would be maybe a reversal of your temporal flow, which didn't used to happen, but potentially could happen now. But actually, that's not what I wanted to ask, though. I actually wanted to ask about network neutrality and torrents, right?
Okay. You have to get more specific on your torrents question, because I mean that covers a lot of territory. Network neutrality. I follow the debate. I don't get deep into it, partly because
That's wise.
I haven't seen anybody really give a completely cogent, provide a completely cogent discussion of all the issues that are at stake. And almost everybody that's involved in this, at least very publicly, is also connected to somebody that has a financial stake in the outcome. So, I mean, frankly, I think that we are way ahead of the curve in an environment like this, where things are changing so rapidly. I think it's dangerous to try to have prophylactic regulation, to anticipate problems that will arise, and to solve the problem before they ever arise. For one thing, then you never know where the problem would have arisen. But second, you're sort of locking into place a technological and industrial regime. And so in that sense, I see it as constraining the pace of innovation. Not from the way that the cable companies are saying that if you do this, we don't have incentive to invest, but because it just balkanizes the process and makes people have to ask for more approvals from regulators at various stages to do something new. Yes?
Real quickly, the last question I would just ask is, could you make a prognostication on the changing political economy of creative labor? A lot of people, going back to user-generated, do you see any sort of new trends politically in how people feel about producing content for free that then creates value for a larger entity, like a Huffington Post or something like that, that then gets capitalized and they don't necessarily see any return? Do you see a shift in the way people feel incentivized to continue creating products?
This actually relates to another line of research I've been pursuing. And there's a fair amount of work on open source software. And most people that contribute to open source software aren't getting a direct financial payment. So then people say, well, why do they do it? And it turns out that there are a lot of other reasons to do that. One, you may like it. And so you have a venue for doing something you like. You may like the fact that you have an audience. And in fact, I believe that there's a recent study when somebody said when the internet was shut down in China, right? So part of the audience goes away. What happens to postings? Well, it turns out the people that would have voluntarily posted, a lot of them stopped doing so. So the audience becomes an incentive. You may do it because it establishes a reputation amongst people that may hire you to do something professional. That becomes a reason to do it. And if that happens, then you can commercialize. And so it becomes a new venue for being recognized. That's probably pretty much what I want to say. I'm sure that the arguments will be made, though, that we're being taken advantage of. But I would turn that around and say, what would you have done otherwise? Right?